Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. This is episode 38. My name is Tom Luongo and we have a lot to talk about. It's Tuesday, it's June 9th, and the U.S. is on fire. Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and the Democrats are pushing for the death of the United States, and the symbology of it is pretty clear. We're going to discuss this and a whole lot more, but before I do, I want to remind you that you can follow my work at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728 as I approached 5,000 subscribers on Twitter asymptotically. Thank you, Jack Dorsey. Live streams, they happen on YouTube every Monday night at 8 p.m. and every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Warning, I'm a bad boy. I've got a potty mouth and I will not stop using it. You can also support verified publishers like myself by downloading and installing the Brave browser, where you can get paid in crypto tokens called BAT for voluntarily being served internet advertising as opposed to feeding the Google beast passively. Brave protects your online privacy while saving you time and bandwidth by blocking all those data snoopers, etc., that are feeding this growing surveillance state. Use my referral code at brave.com/Tom405 to support the podcast directly. If you use Brave for more than 30 days, I'll get the referral fee. Lastly, you can join over the 400 people who support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Gold, Goats, and Guns, where you can sign up for the private market reports published every Wednesday and Sunday, and or the Gold, Goats, and Guns monthly newsletter designed to wrap up all of this geopolitical chaos, the global macroeconomics, and these shifting cultural trends that we're going to talk about today into a portfolio strategy designed to help you make sense of a world going mad. All right, intro done. I want to start today by talking about my wife. She is a marvel. She truly is. After 28 years of marriage, she continually surprises me. She's a perfect example of a person on a continual path of self-improvement. She walks upright with her shoulders back, and she goes about her business every day. She doesn't whine anymore. She doesn't complain. We both did when we were younger. And today, watching her go through her day, tending her gardens, building our homestead, is truly inspiring. And I tell you that because I am so very lucky, and some would say blessed, that I have that. And I know a lot of people don't have that. So just want you to know that it's important, because what she does is to support what I do directly. So while she's tending her garden, she spends her entire day absorbing the best that the internet has to offer in terms of intellectual capacity. From Jordan Peterson to Jonathan Pageau, from the Uber boyos discussing Carl Jung to Ian McGilchrist to Joe Rogan and all the rest of them. Her ability to absorb, synthesize, and apply ideas to our politics supporting what I do is invaluable. Her ability to tease out who's worth listening to and who isn't is even more valuable. Her ability to see the limitations of who is worth listening to and who isn't. And even those who have limitations, she understands still has values. So she examines the meaning crisis that exists that all these guys talk about from all sides. And it helps to inform what I do here. It informs this podcast. It informs everything I write. I don't always directly link to it or footnote it or whatever. I usually just weave it into the narrative as best as I can, because that's what I do. But it's always there. And her political insights are always worth the interruption. And I know that when she comes up to me and she says, well, this is interesting, I put down my keyboard. I put down everything I'm doing. I put my coffee down. I put my phone down. I put everything down and I listen. Because I know what those words mean. So let's talk about how this applies to what's happening today, which is that we are undergoing a civil war. There's no doubt about it. The civil war is here. The coup has been a slow boiling affair since the day Trump was elected. The process of building to this moment has been in play since the moment Trump was declared the victor. In fact, I would argue that once the results for Florida came back, the strategizing of how to get rid of him began. I mean, that's after, of course, Hillary stopped throwing things around the room and trying to murder people. The election of Trump was a fundamental rejection of cultural Marxism by the quote-unquote deplorables. And they accelerated what was already in process. Over the last 4 years, I can tell you that I sat down, I talked with my friends about this stuff, and I talked with my equals, people I consider my equals or betters on a lot of these issues. And they all are like, so 18 months ago, we were talking about blah, and now we're talking about transgendered bathrooms. And we're not talking about now 18 months after transgendered bathrooms, they're talking about, 77 genders. And after that, we're talking about, do we need 100 different bathrooms? What do we do? Identitarian politics have taken a turn for the absurd. Jonathan Pageau talks about this in terms of, imagine having to sort 1 million buttons into blue and green. And then every once in a while you get one, it's red. But the system says just sort the blue and green ones. What do you do with the red ones? What do you do with the yellow ones? What happens when you look at the million buttons and you've got 1,000 odd colored ones that aren't either blue or green? Or even better, don't fit into the very narrow definition of what blue is and what green is. What do you do then? What happens to that system? Well, it breaks down. It breaks down into the same kind of thing that we see here around us today. It breaks down into identitarian politics. It breaks down into the inability to find any kind of solution to any problem, because the problems are endless, because there's always a finer gradient of sin, whether you're a racist or an authoritarian or fascist or this or that. What we have is the birth of a religion. I've talked about this before, and I'll continue to talk about it. We are 2 or 3 generations downstream of the effects of Comintern. And the Comintern never really ended. The organization ended in 1943, but the process of Comintern never ended. Yuri Bezimov talked about this after he defected from the Soviet Union. It's well understood that the long march through the institutions by the cultural Marxists, by the first Stalinists and then the cultural Marxists born out of French postmodernism of the 1970s, were downstream of all this thinking. Okay? And we're seeing the full flower of it as for lack of a better term, a mind virus today. And it was to destroy religion in people who are programmed to need a religion, because we need the social structure that real religions bring, the order and the structure that real religions bring, that good religions bring. And people, if they don't have a religion, will create one. My generation, a lot of agnostic/atheist kids use Star Wars as their religion. There are people who self-identify as Jedi. I mean, it's not a particularly good religion, but it exists. It's an example of what happens here. And today, on the political left, the religion is the state. The whole purpose was to replace God with the state. And now the state has failed them. And this religion now has morphed into something different. And the state has no forgiveness. We've tried to inject morality and forgiveness into the state. It hasn't worked, right? We've tried to create social safety nets and employment programs for people who have fallen through the cracks. And all of the things that the Democrats have championed over the last 50 years of a social safety net and anti-recidivism programs and all the rest of it. All that stuff is, on the surface, a beautiful idea. But the state is the wrong administrator of this. And because they're committed to the state taking on those roles, and they've done so because the commies, of course, wanted the state to destroy the nuclear family, destroy the religion, destroy all the private institutions of culture, and replace them with the state so that the state is superior. What we have now is the flowering of what happens when the state fails. And the state was only able to fund all this stuff because it was unsustainable through fake money and in the Federal Reserve and all the things I talked about all the time, that a corrupt money creates a corrupt society. It's also funded the creation of that corrupt society that now everybody's out on the streets complaining about. Rightfully so. But it has nothing to do with George Floyd. So our democratic institutions now are our religion, and that religion has failed. And so now they don't know what to do. And so we have what happens when people we know what happens when people without religion create one. Invariably, they are bad ones. They are ones without the institutions that constantly reinforce behavior on a day-to-day basis. Voting every 4 years is not, a weekly church service. It's not the same thing. Worse now, because we're in this situation, we're not even allowed to talk about what the real problems are and to find solutions for them. Scott Adams has been pointing this out daily on his periscopes, and he's absolutely right. How can we solve problems that we can't even that half the population isn't even allowed to talk about without being labeled a racist? More than half the population, because, let's be honest, whites make up a majority of the United States. So invariably, this is an anti-Christian religion, this religion of the state. It's bereft of forgiveness. Therefore, it's bereft of process and the potential for rebirth. This is the new religion of the left. And that religion is self-hatred. It's openly anti-white, anti-individual, anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-you. And I remember saying a long time ago to Lew Rockwell, the head of the Mises Institute and publisher of LewRockwell.com, at one point, the slogan for LewRockwell.com morphed from anti-state, anti-something, pro-market. And then he changed that to opt out of the state, briefly. And I emailed him. I said, Lew, I really like this new one because it's positive. There's nothing anti about it. There's nothing negative about it. Because nothing constructive comes from being anti-negative. You can't define yourself through negation of everyone else, which is exactly what these people are doing. Okay? It's exactly what's happening here, is that this is they're trying to define who they are and what they believe in by negating everybody else, because they refuse to look at themselves and see that they're actually empty and that they have no sense of self and they have no purpose and they have no meaning. So if you have no meaning, you have to, and you see it in other people, you have to strip it from them. I say this all the time about Marxists, that they have an unquenchable envy, and the thing that they most envious of is not your property. It's not your children. It's not your wealth. It's none of those things. It's your meaning. It's your purpose. They hate you for your purpose because they don't have one. They are united in tearing everything down. It's that moment in Fight Club when Tyler Durden turns to the narrator after he beats the crap out of Jared Leto and he says, "What in the hell's gotten into you?" And he says, "I just wanted to destroy something beautiful." By doing all this, all they're doing is exposing their lack of self-awareness. In Jungian terms, they deny their shadow. And eventually we get to that point is what Jonathan Pageau calls the inversion, where black is white, up is down, freedom is slavery, and diversity is strength. And our stories always tell us that during the depths of despair, we're going to happen at the moment of inversion, when everything is backwards. Right now, today, they're pushing female superheroes onto us as opposed to male heroes. At some point, he uses the argument like bizarro Superman. Like in the history of Superman had to get more and more weird to be interesting until we finally get to the point where he's inverted and he's just the opposite of himself, right? And that's why it's interesting, I note, in the culture, why people have rejected, for example, Zack Snyder's version of Superman and Man of Steel, which was a thorough and complete reboot of Superman back to his roots, back to fundamentally who he is, and trying to define who he was and what he was. And they rejected the symbol of Superman. They wanted the symbol of Superman, traditional Superman fans. They didn't get that. What they got was a man who then walks into the role of being a god, but still aware of the fact that he's a man, which is a very radical concept within Superman mythology. And it was really hurtful to traditional Superman fans who at that moment in time needed the reinforcement of their symbology and of their effectively their religion, of their god, as opposed to having to take a hard look at him. Because their response to the chaos was they wanted to hold on to that which they've already known. I've been arguing this about Star Wars fans for years now. It's the same process. It's the same problem they're having. They don't understand that the Star Wars of the 1970s spoke to that generation. The Star Wars of the prequel films spoke to that generation's children. And the Star Wars films of today speak to the young generation of today. And I make this point over and over again that the stories and the mythology haven't changed. And I can understand why people are so angry at the inversion of the hero in the Star Wars by making effectively Luke into Rey. But the problem is that Rey's story is not the same as Luke's. So I'm not going to go too far down this line, but I disagree with that. But I understand where the anger and where the rejection of it comes from and why people don't think it's real. I get it. I get so many angles on this because it's this inversion, and we're at a crisis moment in our time and in our society. So of course we're going to reject anything we feel is part of that inversion process. And maybe even it was. Maybe the genesis of these things was that they wanted to create this inversion cynically. We're going to do this. But then they write a story that reaffirms it all. And that's the interesting part about it. And these same people are the ones that rejected Zack Snyder, which is very interesting. Okay. So look at where we are, right? And I always find it interesting as I was listening to that talk about Superman, the first thing that popped into my head was Mary Poppins, right? And this is Mary Poppins. It's a perfect example of why Mary Poppins is such a great movie. And then why Mary Poppins Returns is just as good a movie. Well, I don't say just as good a movie, but it's a worthy successor for this generation, because the moment of absolute abject despair is when they go to visit Mary Poppins' cousins. And, in the first movie, the guy's, having tea on the ceiling. And in the second movie, Meryl Streep has every second Wednesday, her world turns upside down. Interesting, right? This explains gender dysphoria. It explains the 75 friggin' genders. It explains the fight right now between a creator, J.K. Rowling, who's calling bullshit on all this and saying, "Oh my God, you got to be kidding me. There aren't 67 genders. You can't walk out. You cannot erase gender. Women are women. What are we going to do? We call them people who menstruate? You can't do that." I said that to Camille. I said, she said that. And the first thing she said was, I reject you oppressing me as a premenopausal woman who doesn't menstruate regularly anymore. And after I'm postmenopausal, well, it's going to be even worse. Of course, she was kidding because my wife is awesome. And I just looked at her and I went, beautiful. And then, but notice that the creator of story, J.K. Rowling, sees the limits of this. But the actors, the people who pretend to be other people, Emma Watson shaves her head, Daniel Radcliffe says, no, she's wrong, right? They all come out in support of all this because that's who they are. They're fake people in the first place. They're people without souls, ultimately. They're certainly people who were most definitely, abused as children while on the movie set. So, I'm not surprised that that's what happens. But there's a fundamental thing between creators and actors. We're at a moment in the inversion up until this point where irreality is championed. Reality is questioned. Basic concepts of human physiology are under attack in the most idiotic ways imaginable. And yet we are forced to listen to this because the power structure feeds off of this. And they're doing it to retain control over the narrative and retain control over the levers of power. And they think that they can control this chaos that they've unleashed. And that's where we are. So artificial divisions are reinforced. We're forced to wear masks, even though COVID-19 is now no longer a thing and no one even buys it anymore. And yet still this afternoon, I'm going to go to get my passport process started. I'm going to have to walk into the Columbia County Courthouse with a mask on because they demand it, even though there's no reason for it. What they're saying to you is ultimately that good citizens must continue to take a knee to the state, which I unfortunately will do in order to try and have an escape path away from this failing state. And you have to take a knee not only to the state, but also to the victims of their privilege and reject property, which is insane, right? That's where we are. That's the inversion. Reject property, reject individuality, reject all of your privilege, and take a knee to the victims of this. Even though those people don't want your victim status. They don't want this. I watch YouTube video after YouTube video after YouTube video of people, of black people, inner city black people going, what are white people doing? What are you, crazy? Are you then surprised that Pelosi et al. Took a knee, while they went to introduce their defund the police legislation, which is a massive virtue signal. And they did so while committing the sin of cultural appropriation. And that's all they were talking about on Twitter. How is this not cultural appropriation to wear these kente scarves? What are they doing? They don't have any clue as to what they've unleashed. They don't have any idea of how far along this process is and that they're no longer in control of it. And so now they're just bowing, hoping they think they can be spared. And they continue to try and create photo ops to show their inclusiveness and to show their decency and to show that we're the ones who should be the stewards of the new America, and no one believes them. Meanwhile, AOC is out there, and Ilhan Omar and the rest of them are out there plotting the actual takeover of Washington, D.C., and they're going to destroy the Pelosi's and the Schumers and the rest of them. Their kneeling is worse than Trump's upside-down Bible by far. And the reason for this is that Trump stood up straight, his defiant, his shoulders back, his chin up like he always does, and he stood in front of St. John's in D.C., which Antifa burned. It doesn't matter that he's a terrible person. What matters is the symbolism. It doesn't matter that Trump is as Christian as Pelosi is. I mean, please. I don't buy any religiosity in Trump, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that he understands where his power ultimately comes from. It's not from bowing to the voters. It's from acknowledging what the voters actually want. Tradition and culture. They're willing to bend that tradition and bend those cultures. Sure. But we're not going to wholesale change it and throw it away and all of a sudden embrace, gender dysphoria and the rest of it when we all run around in clown masks. Like, were they crazy? We're not all just going to become Joker tomorrow, which is what Antifa wants us to do. While we do that, look, see, we're all inclusive. We're all the Joker now, aren't we? And the Joker's like walking into the White House and then is going to start taking people out behind the chemical shed and shooting them in the head. That's what comes next. So going back to Jonathan Pageau, you've got first, inversion, which is where we've been, and then death. He makes the point of what comes after Mardi Gras, Ash Wednesday. There's always the Day of the Dead. There's Halloween, which is the Day of the Dead, and then there's All Saints Day, which is the rebirth, the day after that, right? There's all this stuff. These things all happen in our traditions and our holiday schedule and all of this stuff. It's all there. Inversion, death, rebirth. Inversion, death, rebirth. Trump's first term was the inversion. The second term, if he has one, will be the death of the U.S. And even if he wins the election and then is impeached, potentially, as Mike Cernovich is projecting that he could win the election and lose the Senate. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but that's what Cernovich has been peddling recently. Let's talk about it. Let's at least float it. Whatever comes, the presidential term of 2020 to 2024 will be the death of the U.S. for all practical purposes. And what comes after that is rebirth. I want you to think about Russia post-Soviet Union as a perfect corollary for this. The violent repressive system of the USSR collapsed. It took about 10 years for it to collapse, just like it's taken about 10 years for the United States to completely get to the point where it could collapse. 10, maybe 12 years. Started with 2008. And I'm sure that, you could probably trace it back to the USSR's seizing up, destroying itself back to the late 70s. Certainly we went through those periods where we went from, Brezhnev and drop off to eventually the Gorbachev. We went to like 2 or 3 of them all in a row, right? That's a perfect example. But that system collapsed. There was a decade of looting, violence, culture was destroyed, churches had all been burned and destroyed, right? They were at the depths of despair, Russian mail order brides were a thing, like the whole 9 yards. Society had collapsed completely. Birth rates were in the gutter. The ethnic Russians were being talked about as being a people that couldn't replace themselves and would eventually be destroyed. It was only up until just very recently that we've stopped having the demographic discussion about the end of ethnic Russians. Like that conversation only ended about 2 years ago. What happens when Putin takes over? What happens after Yeltsin, who was a traitor to the Russian people? He hands off to Putin to restart civilization, who then starts doing so in his own way as best he can, riding people through the rebirth. And the rebirth takes a long time. Destroying things is quick. It took no time at all to destroy Russia post-Politburo. It's taken 20 years to even begin rebuilding it. There's a lesson here. Unfortunately, that lesson is that there's no way out of this but through. We're not going to get out of this without the Civil War. The culture war has become the Civil War. It's steeped deeply in psychology. It's steeped deeply in the intractability of the left brain and its inability to accept any meaning coming from the right brain and any warnings coming from the right brain. These people are in fight or flight mode. They're praying now to black people. Like, it's spooky and it's scary and it's only going to get worse from here and it's not going to get better. And there's no real good way around it. Politics is almost irrelevant when you really stop to think about it. This is a thing that has taken on a life of its own and it has to burn itself out. Kind of like COVID-19. The question is, how much damage is it going to do? Is it going to be what we thought COVID-19 was going to be? Millions dead, the whole 9 yards, systems overwhelmed? Or is it going to be a puddle that we splash in? It's going to be a deep frozen lake that we have to somehow get ourselves out of? Or is it going to be a shallow puddle that makes our feet wet and kind of uncomfortable? I don't know at this point. Part of me thinks the latter. Believe it or not, I'm an optimist. Why wouldn't I be? I have the world's greatest wife. Community, connection, construction. Those are the things that we need to focus on, not who's in control of DC. The biggest worry I have about the Civil War is who winds up in charge of the nuclear weapons and the military. That's a different discussion for a different day. Right now, the best we can do as people is to remind ourselves that the only thing we can control is our reactions to all of this. We can't control everybody else. All we can do is control ourselves. And if we take care of ourselves and tend our own garden, like my wife does every day, we have a better chance of getting through this with as minimal damage as possible. Because the world's going to tend to itself whether we like it or not. All right, this has been the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. If you like what you heard today, please like this podcast, share it, subscribe to it, do whatever you have to do. Let people know. And I have an interview, hopefully, to go off to get done with Whitney Webb. We're going to do that talk in a couple of days, and I'll have that for you next week. So you guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.